Good evening, everyone. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the Artistic Director of the Ottawa International Writers Festival, and I'm broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I want to begin, as always, by thanking you all for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but I know wherever you're tuning in from right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. The festival is supported by generous individuals like you, so I hope you'll consider subscribing to our newsletter and making a donation. We can't do this without you. I also want to thank the Ottawa Public Library, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, the City of Ottawa, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, Carleton University, and CBC for their ongoing support. We've got lots of great events coming up. Our guest on Thursday is Mark Critch, and Friday's podcasts will feature Booker nominee Ruth Ozeki and two-time Governor General's Award winner Jordan Tannehill, so there's lots to look forward to. Our host tonight is Susan Delacourt. Susan is a national columnist for the Toronto Star. She's written 4 political books, including Shopping for Votes, which was a finalist for the Writers' Trust Prize in Nonfiction, so we're in good hands. Please give a warm virtual welcome to our host this evening, Susan Delacourt.
Thank you, and very nice to be here virtually, somewhat strangely. I sit here around the corner from another great Ottawa bookstore, independent bookstore, Beechwood Books, where Peter's book, I believe, is selling like hotcakes. I'm honored to do this. I'm not going to talk too much tonight. I want Peter to do all the talking, but I will say that I arrived in Ottawa in the late 1980s, and my very first day in Ottawa, I had come up here to get the lay of the land, and a colleague took me to lunch at the press club, which is now gone, but and everyone in the press club was talking about, is Peter Mansbridge going to move to the United States? It was the story of the day. Everybody was buzzing about it and chatting about it. And I thought, this is my introduction to Ottawa. And it's weird to think back from that day to this, that here I am talking to Peter, who thankfully did not go to the United States. I think we will talk about that a bit too. But I'm honored to talk to somebody who I got to know as a fellow journalist, but more like you out there, ordinary Canadians. He was in my living room every night. He narrated the news to me. He told me what was happening. I trusted him, and I am so glad that he stayed. What I love about this book, and I was just telling Peter before we went on air, I've now read it twice. Well, today was sort of a rereading of it, but it's the stories that journalists love to tell. Journalists love to tell stories behind the stories, and what happened before the camera went on, or what happened after it went off. And this book, you can pick it up at any point, open it up, and find a great story in there, and think, I remember that, and I didn't know this part about it. So I'm going to try to get Peter to talk a bit about that tonight, and talk a little bit about journalism too, because I think he has some important things to say. But since this is the Ottawa Writers Festival, and I've warned him about this, Peter, I'm not sure people understand how much Peter is a man of Ottawa. He was born in England, moved to what became Malaysia. I don't believe it was Malaysia at that point. And then you moved to Canada when you were 6, is that right, Peter?
Yeah.
And then you moved to Ottawa. And you became a Canadian citizen while your family lived in the Glebe in 1959. So I think for the audience tonight, who I assume are Ottawa people and lovers of all things writing, if you could just tell us about the Ottawa you knew as a child, and which you've told a couple of stories, a couple of great stories in your book, actually. But tell us the Ottawa you knew as a child.
Sure, but first of all, let me just thank you, Susan, for taking part in this evening, and for having read the book and saying the nice things you've already said about it. Susan is somebody who, I've always admired as a journalist, chased down many of the stories that Susan broke over the years, and now read her opinion pieces or columns with with a lot of interest in what she has to say about events nationally in this country. Ottawa. I mean, listen, Ottawa became this great home for us when we moved here after, as you said, being in England and then in Southeast Asia. We were excited to get here. I was really excited because for the first time I saw snow. For the first time I was, taken to a hockey rink. Arriving with a cricket bat probably wasn't a great idea, but it was fun. We started off after we got in Ottawa in Manor Park, and then we ended up moving into the Glebe, an area that we love. I lived on 4th Avenue. I lived on 5th Avenue. I'm a part owner of a small restaurant in Ottawa right now that's in the Glebe on Bank Street. But nevertheless, Ottawa growing up was great. I went to Muchmore Public School on 5th Avenue. Then I went to Glashan for grade 7 and 8. And then I went to Glebe Collegiate Institute, GCI, yellow and blue. What we want, we always do. That was the fun. I played a little basketball there, played a little football, not very good at either, but managed to, wear the colors for the big team. But I guess the moment that I talk about in the book about Glebe is a particular one about a teacher I had in English, an English teacher. And the reason I talked about her is because all of us guys in her class were in love with her because we just thought she was beautiful and she was a nice person and we loved her English class. Her name was Phyllis Bruce. And we were all kind of jealous of her boyfriend who used to turn up every once in a while and wait for her outside the classroom door. And we all knew who he was because we saw him on television in Ottawa at CGOH. We saw him on Saturday afternoons when he did the kind of local rock show, like a Dick Clark kind of show. And we saw him reading the news at CGOH. And his name, of course, was Peter Jennings. And so I used to, we'd walk out of the class and Peter Jennings would be standing there, which was a big thrill to me. But Phyllis Bruce and Peter were good friends then and remained good friends through the rest of his life. Phyllis left Ottawa and became a very successful editor and publisher of books in Canada, still is today. And it's ironic, really, the way things turned out. I had no idea I'd end up in broadcasting or anchoring. And yet there was Peter Jennings, and I certainly had no idea I'd ever write a book. And there was Phyllis Bruce. So it was kind of funny. But that Ottawa connection.
I love. I love that story to start off because it's such a small world story of Canada that Peter Jennings and Peter Mansbridge sort of were sweet on the same woman who turns out to be a publishing giant. You two turn out to be the leading anchors in North America. And Phyllis Bruce, actually, I had a contract with her to write a book at one point too, because Canada is a very small country. So I love that for a writers' festival. Phyllis Bruce actually taught one of the greatest anchors and dated another one. And Sarah Jennings is Peter's sister, is well known to the Ottawa writers and cultural community too. So tell us though how you ended up. I'm sure your story is legendary to many people, but I'm sure some have tuned in for some of these stories too. How you ended up being a guy going to high school in Ottawa, ended up in Churchill, Manitoba, and then what happened? Just give us a little sense of.
Sure. The early part of the story is not a pretty one. I mean, I went to Glebe. I was very proud of being at Glebe and had a lot of good friends at Glebe. Those good friends all ended up going to university. Most of them going to Carleton. I didn't get through high school. I went into the Navy, and then I didn't last very long in the Navy, almost 2 years. And then suddenly I was kind of out of work, but I had become really fascinated by living in Western Canada. I'd been in the Navy. I'd been in both BC at one point and in Manitoba. At another point, I was taking flying training, so I was at Port Prairie, Manitoba. So I moved out west after I got out of the Navy, and sort of kind of bounced around looking for a job. And I ended up, I was only, I was barely 20. I was still 19. And I ended up with a small airline called Transair, which was a regional service. And it flew through Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario, Saskatchewan, and up into the Central Arctic. And I was kind of a relief agent. I'd go around, fill in for guys who were on holidays. And at that point, they were all guys. And so they came to me one day. I was in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. They said, "We need you to go up to Churchill, Manitoba for 2 weeks. There's a guy going on holidays, so you go up there." So I flew up to Churchill, and the guy never came back from holidays, and I never left. They said, "You got to stay there now." So I stayed in Churchill, and I had a great time as a young kid, making not a lot of money, a couple $100 a month. And one day, the ticket agents asked me to announce the flight, so I did. I got behind the microphone, and I did the Transair flight 106 for Thompson La Pond, Winnipeg is now ready for boarding, and everybody rushed over to the gate, except one guy. He came towards me, and his name was Gaston Charpentier, and he says, introduced himself as the manager of the CBC radio station in Churchill. And he said, "I've got a job opening. You've got a great voice. I can't get anybody to fill the late night shift at the radio station. It won't be a lot, 4 or 5 hours a day, Monday to Friday. Would you be interested?" I said, "Absolutely. It sounds like fun." So I started the next night, no training, nothing, no HR department to say, "Who is this guy?" Tell us about yourself. I never said anything to anybody about my past. It was all, straight up based on the voice. And that's how I started at the CBC. Now, a lot of things happen. The young journalists today think I went, from the baggage counter at Transair to reading the answer. Well, it didn't quite work that way. But still, that's how it started.
Yeah. Did you know at the time that something had happened, that your life was changing? Did you have a sense even then?
I think I did because, listen, I had great opportunities. I had wonderful parents, I had a great upbringing, lived in a great part of a great city. And I kind of botched every opportunity I had, whether it was at school or whether it was in the Navy. And suddenly this kind of came out of nowhere for me. It was a total fluke, right? And within a very short period of time, I realized two things. One, I didn't understand music, and I shouldn't go into the music field. But second, I love talking on air, and I love broadcasting. And so I also knew that I loved journalism. There was no newscast in Churchill at the time. And so I started one with no training, but a curious mind. Like any good journalist, as you know, Susan, you got to be curious. You got to be willing to ask and challenge.
You can't teach curiosity. Yeah,
you can't teach curiosity. And so that's how it all started. Then you layer on all kinds of experience and education and training. But that's how it started in Churchill. And, it was a lot of fun experimenting with the field of journalism and the technology of that day, which was pretty minimum. It was just radio at that point for me. The first 3 years of my career was all radio. But it was, it was great fun. I remember a lot of the lessons I learned at that day, not just about the business, but about politics, from covering local politicians, town council and school boards. And I still maintain to many young journalists that it's those decisions that are made at the what we call the local level that have the most influence on people, on citizens.
Yeah.
Who looks after their garbage, who paves the roads, who's responsible for the sewers, who's responsible for schools, at a local level. That's where you find out the real grassroots of how politics works and how people are connected to the decisions that are made by those elected officials.
Yeah, I am a big subscriber to that idea. All politics is local too, and I think we see it more and more too in the way politics has evolved. I like the story that you applied in Belleville as well, and they said no, maybe you don't have. You want to tell us for if there are any writers out here who have got rejection letters, they'll like this story.
Yeah. Well, I got frustrated, after a while in Churchill. Once I realized this was what I wanted to do with my life, I wanted to start moving on. There are only so many polar bear stories you could tell, which are, stories in Churchill. Um, so at that point, there was no movement at the CBC happening. And so I started scouting the trade magazines, and I saw this opening in CJBQ in Belleville, Ontario. And I thought, wow, I got to try for that. So I put together a tape of the few things I'd done at that point, an audio tape, and I sent it in the mail. And then it was this painful wait for a reply. It took quite a long time before I got a reply. And I could tell when the envelope arrived, it was pretty thin. And so I was worried. I opened it up, and it basically said, the last lines of it were, we just don't see a future for you in broadcasting. But thanks for applying.
I wish you'd kept that letter and framed it.
Yeah, I wish I had too. I was had to give a dinner speech in Belleville, I don't know, about 10 years ago. And I told that story, and they thought it was very funny. But one of the station executives from CJBQ, who was relatively new in the job, got up afterwards to introduce himself, and almost a way of saying he was sorry. And I said, "It's okay, it's like a work."
And so it did. So after that you ended up in Winnipeg, and now I'm sort of nudging you into political journalism, our shared interest here. The first election you ever covered, or sort of did, was 1972, where another Trudeau altogether was around. What do you remember of that 72 election?
Well, in those days, CBC used to do local cut-ins every half hour that could go on for like 3 or 4 minutes and give the local ridings. And the dozen or so seats in Manitoba were always interesting break. They don't vote in a block in Manitoba like they usually do in Saskatchewan and Alberta. It's a real 3-party race. Always has been in Manitoba. So they asked me. I'd moved to Winnipeg in early 1971. By that time in 72, they thought that I'd moved into television, and they thought I should be, one of the 2 main anchors. The main anchor was the supper time news host, and then me as kind of like an analyst. And it was a heck of a night, right? I mean, that night, everybody went to bed without really knowing what had happened. It was so close. As it turned out, Trudeau edged Stanfield by 2 seats. But there were moments during that night where it looked like it could go the other way. So that was a pretty exciting night, and it was the first time I'd been involved in election coverage. And I thought, wow, this is what it's going to be like every election. Well, that was 15 elections ago. The numbers,
exactly, yeah.
The ones that I've covered. But so I remember that part of the night. I remember just a couple of minutes before, it was my first one, so I was very nervous. The guy beside me, the supper time news host, was a fellow by the name of Bill Guest, who anybody with a background of any time in Manitoba will know that name, because he was extremely popular. He was an awfully nice guy, and he was also the host of Reach for the Top, the kids quiz show. Anyway, so we'd done, a number of kind of, rehearsals, if you want to call them that, beforehand, and everything was fine. But here we were suddenly a minute before broadcast, and I'm nervous. I'm really nervous. So I look over at Bill sitting beside me, and he looks fine from the kind of waist up. But below the desk, his hands were shaking. And I looked at him and I said, "Bill, you're not nervous, are you?" And he said, "Listen, kid, the day you're not nervous is the day you're not ready for the show. You got to be nervous."
I love that story.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I love that
he's
story.
right, and I've always remembered that, and I always get a little bit nervous. I did every night on the national all those years. I'd always be a little bit nervous, and I'd feel good about it. Having
Yeah,
that little bit of nervous energy before the program started.
I remember a couple of times. I only did it a couple of times, the ad issue panel, and thinking I'm going to die before I do this show. Like it was so nerve wracking being on that big set, and I thought, how do people ever get used to this? What I liked about that story you told is that you never get used to it, and you shouldn't. Right?
No,
It's a privilege,
it,
right?
it, it makes you realize that it's important, for one,
Yeah,
and two, it kind of drives the energy and the adrenaline. When that
yeah.
issue, we were all nervous except one person, the great Chantal Aubert. She's sitting
Exactly.
there.
Yes.
It's easy to get nervous when you're sitting across from her.
I did. This is not about. I did years ago. Peter Zosky had Chantel and I come into the studio in Vancouver really early one morning to explain what was going on in the Constitution. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning, and Peter starts with me and he says, "Susan, tell us what's happening." And I choked, like I think mentally, and like it was 4 in the morning, and to me it was the 15 seconds of doom. They made me listen to it after. It wasn't that bad. But for about a year after, every time I went home with Chantel, anytime, she arrived with cough candies, water, something. She would pile them all in front of me to.
Right.
Um,
It's
so I think
amazing.
people like to hear that you can't. Do you remember a night, any night in particular, beyond the first one, that made you nervous on the national, like a moment where you knew that the nation was watching you, and sort of Peter, don't screw up. Like, did you have those any moment like that you can remember?
Well, there was always sort of a current of that running through your through
Yeah.
your veins, but for the most part, the big nights were the ones I loved the most because you knew they'd be
Yeah.
watching, and you knew they wanted
Yeah.
to hear why something had happened, and just what in fact had happened. So those were high energy nights, and there were, I was lucky. I mean, I was there long enough. There had to be a few, and there were a lot of them. And
Yeah.
you thrive on those days. Those are the kind of days when it ends as a journalist. You almost feel sad, right? Because
Yeah.
you've been through this incredible period of time, and you just told the story that a nation's waiting for, and that could be on television or it could be on print, like you used to do, and still do. But those were very special nights. I can remember anchoring big shows, like I always tend to think of the referendum night in the second
Oh yeah.
referendum, both of them. That's how long I've been around. But the '95 referendum, when it ended, like after any big show, I can't just leave and go to sleep. You're up. And so on that night in Montreal, some of us just walked around a little bit in downtown Montreal. And it was really revealing on a number of counts because you saw a lot of people and you said to yourself, wow, if, in so many other countries in the world, many of which we've been to cover, major events that divided a nation, it could get pretty ugly, you know, uh, on the night of a decision. Um, but not so in Quebec. I mean, there were a couple of small fires in the streets, but almost more celebratory than anything. It was quiet. Life was about to move on. The moment
Yeah.
had happened, and it was about to move on. And it was one of those nights when I'm covering a Canadian story where you say to yourself, "Man, I'm so lucky to live in this country." Um, because there's a lot we can handle. There are a lot of things that we still need to work on, and
Yeah.
we know what they are. But we've also managed to survive some pretty difficult moments.
I want to take you back just to the 80s a little bit, because I think, some of us, maybe people my age, got to know you as an accomplished and fascinating political reporter in a fascinating time. I think, the late 70s and 80s here were a really interesting time in Canadian politics, where we saw a lot of influences from the States moving here. But I wanted to just ask you generally about the politics of the Mulroney, the sort of switch from Trudeau to Mulroney, what you saw, and then take you to a story that the 1988 Liberal coup story,
Mm-hmm.
which I think had shadows in it of journalism to come. But first, let's just talk about what it was like here in the 80s.
Sure. Don't forget, I'd grown up in Canada. My first indication of politics and that I was interested in, and even though I didn't really realize how interested I was in, was 57 and 58. I mean, I can remember watching as a kid, as a 10-year-old, watching the CBC coverage of both those elections. And Charlie Lynch was the,
Right? Yeah.
anchor for the CBC, even though he was a newspaper journalist. But, the excitement around those elections, and then the whole end of the Diefenbaker years, the Pearson years, and the fact that both their leaderships were in some degree of turmoil. Diefenbaker, because there was a lot of people within the party wanted to get rid of him. Pearson, because he couldn't achieve a majority. He had back-to-back minority governments. So I'd seen this whole leadership thing unfold, and then Trudeau came into power. And, he went through his various election scenarios, lost in 79. The only person who's ever beaten a Trudeau is Joe Clark.
Joe Clark.
The only person who's ever beaten a Trudeau
Yeah.
is Joe Clark. Well, a lot of people go, you got to be kidding. Really? Joe Clark? And not only did Joe Clark win, but as I said, nobody else has ever beaten a Trudeau, either in a national election or in his riding. And then this guy called Brian Mulroney comes on the stage. Not out of the blue, he'd lost the leadership attempt in 76. And then he was behind a lot of the sniping at Joe Clark after Joe Clark lost the election in 1980. And he becomes the leader in 83. I developed a good journalist covering a political figure relationship with Mulroney, starting in 82, and we kept that relationship up. And I tell a story in the book about the night before the Conservative Leadership Convention in June of '83.
Tell a little bit about that.
Well, it was an opportunity. I met with all the candidates, John Crosby and David Crombie, and Joe Clark, of course, and and others. But Mulroney was always looked at as, this could be his year. And so I met him the night before in the Shadow Laurier. And basically I wanted to get his sense of how he thought the day was going to unfold. And we got into a room, just the two of us, and he went through stage by stage, ballot by ballot, exactly what he thought would happen. And Mulroney, he can tell a good story when he wants to, and the story gets better every time he tells it. But on that night, what he outlined to me was exactly the way it unfolded the next day. And
I think one of the most interesting, fascinating, exciting leadership conventions in the world to watch. That was June 11th that day. That is my birthday. And Mulroney then, he was big on anniversaries. He'd do something every June 11th. It was also his daughter's birthday. Yeah, he did something to wreck my birthday for the entire time he was in office, and even beyond. But that's another story. But I spent my birthday watching that convention. I wasn't yet in Ottawa. I wasn't yet a political reporter, but I could not leave
No.
But journalism that's when I first came to Ottawa. Journalism, I wouldn't mind you talking about how you see journalism as it was practiced then in the 80s, when it was sort of the heyday of political journalism. I think it was a very prestigious job. How you see the difference between then and now? Certainly I've seen it.
Well, a lot of things have changed between then and now, not just journalism, but politics has changed,
Yeah,
much more
yeah,
polarized. Those days in the 70s and 80s, I mean, they would really go at it on the floor of the House of Commons in question period and in debate. The opposing sides, mainly the Liberals and the Conservatives, but the NDP under David Lewis and then Ed Broadbent were no slouches either. But at the end of the day, it was not uncommon to see these MPs, the men and women on either side, going out for supper together, having social
yeah,
events of different kinds. It was not unusual to see that.
yeah,
And then it started to change. One of the things that changed it was television in the House of Commons.
yeah,
It was a much different place before TV was there. So that started the changes. And then in the 80s, when Mulroney came to power, the Liberals, who were kind of on their heels because they had wound up after Trudeau with only 40 seats under John Turner, and they made their mark by this group of MPs called the Gang of Four,
the Rat Pack.
The Rat Pack, and John Nunziata and Sheila Copps and Brian Tobin. I forget who the fourth
Yep.
one was. I
Nunziata.
remember. I can see him. He was Glengarry, Prescott, Russell, or somewhere
Boudria.
in Don
Boudria.
Boudria. That's and anyway, they went after Mulroney, hammer and fist. They really went after Mulroney and his cabinet, and they had some success in doing that, in bringing down cabinet ministers as well as some good journalism. But that set a very different tone in the place that has carried, it looks pretty good today compared with now. But that changed a lot of things, and it changed journalism. Journalism became much more bare knuckles. And nothing was left unsaid or unreported. It all came out, and you could argue that was good. That's good for the system. You can argue the other side of things too, that it's led to this period of polarization, not just on Parliament Hill, but in the country.
I do think it's it's criticism now of character rather than of policy too. Like it's just so much character driven. It's this is going wrong because you're a liar, you're a bad person. It's I sound old now when I say it to the younger journalists too, but I can remember when it would have been shocking to call somebody a liar. That would have been the nuclear option. But it's kind of like another day at the office now. And tell us a little bit about that coup story, because I think that story was ahead of its time. I think in so many ways that when John Turner, you got wind of the fact that John Turner, his own party, was going to try to unseat him in the middle of the 1988 election. I think people have forgotten this amazing story.
Yeah, it's a pretty good story. I'd just taken over the National, but I was still a reporter at heart, but I was an anchor. But I got wind of this story, and then, with the help of others, including Ellie Alboin, who was the bureau chief in Ottawa at the time, Don Newman, who was the head of the weekend, look at this weekend Parliament program, but a great reporter as well. We worked on it. It was kind of my story, but everybody pitched in because we knew that if we were going to nail this one down, it was going to be controversial. It was going to come in the middle of a campaign, and we'd need more than the traditional two sources. And so by the time it actually went to air, there were four sources. But we knew it, it was controversial. We knew it was going to be denied, and it was not an outright denial, but the kind of denial where they're denying things that you never said in the first place, right? Um,
I
and
know a story about that. For those out there who aren't familiar with this story, it was remarkable in 1988, in the middle of the election campaign. CBC, it wasn't the lead, as you point out in your book, it wasn't the lead story on the news that night. It was third,
yeah,
but it was the people. John Turner had been asked to step down in the middle of the election campaign, presumably to be replaced by Jean Chrétien. Although that wasn't in the story, it was just he'd been asked to step down. Which we'd never seen before, and it set the election on fire. And then the recriminations started. Right? That's not a real story. It didn't happen. Right?
yeah,
The story I
that,
heard from Turner's people after was that Turner's denial was very carefully written. So he said, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And what he meant was, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard was being asked to step down, not the CBC story. But yeah.
No, they were very careful, as they always are. Some of these parties that are aided by people that we know that are normally in the in consulting and advisory capacities in different businesses. Anyway, they denied it, but it was and unfortunately at the time a number of journalistic organizations decided to go with their denials and basically started crapping on us and me in particular. So and I was vulnerable. I had just taken this job over. So it was an interesting position to be put in, to say the least. But we stuck by the story, and we never folded on it. As it turned out, Turner a week later made this incredible comeback in the debate in the middle of the '88 campaign, where he took on Trudeau over free trade, and so he managed to recover. They were on the verge of being almost wiped out in that election campaign. But he made a big comeback, and in fact doubled his seats, went from 40 to roughly 80 seats in the '88 campaign, saved his job for at least one more year. But it was 6 months later that Peter Connolly, who was the chief of staff to John Turner, finally admitted at a conference, a post-election conference at Queen's University, that in fact it had happened. That was everything we'd said in that story was true. And as I say in the book, the one relationship that it never had an impact on for me was my relationship with Turner, which was solid before that campaign and remained solid after, and then after he'd left politics and after I'd left journalism. We'd still meet on occasion for lunch, and they were great times. He was a wonderful storyteller, John Turner, but he never betrayed confidences. So he would take you to the edge on a story. he wouldn't jump in at the penultimate moment. But I always enjoyed my times with John Turner. I know he had his weaknesses, and there's no doubt about that. But he was a pretty interesting guy, and you could learn a lot by listening to the stories that he'd seen and witnessed in Ottawa.
Really decent man. My tiny piece of trivia, brush with fame with that, is at the Globe, we were trying to follow that story for months after. We were, trying to look into and it was true, as you, doubly true, but the immediate, trying to follow that story the next day, I decided to phone MPs randomly. And a woman I phoned, one of the candidates was a woman named Shaughnessy Cohen, who confirmed it, because she'd been one of the people out, she was part of the story. She's not named in it. You guys probably never even found her either. But that was how I got to know a woman named Shaughnessy Cohen, who became a good friend, and I wrote my second book about her, too. So this is a literary festival. Anyway, I want to talk about more current things. I think when I read your book the first time, I got to the chapter, and you called it "What Is It?" And I thought, I almost wrote you an email as I was reading the chapter, and I went, Peter, you could have written a whole book out of this chapter. There's a lot of insight in this one tiny chapter in the book. So tell us a little bit about what what's in What Is It, and what you wanted to say.
It is this strange quality that some people have, and I describe it in terms of television journalists. But you could make it fit in almost any profession. It's when others look at you and they say, "Wow, she's got it, or he's got it," and they can't really define what it is, but it's something that they're attracted to. In the way the person talks, the way the person looks, the things the person has to say. Does that person have the same kind of feelings about issues that I do, or speaks the same kind of things that I think? All of those things can be it. My issue with it, especially when it comes to television, is that too often, and I benefited from this myself. You could say that Gaston Charpentier saw it when he heard me, doing that airline announcement. The fellow at CBS who wanted to hire me to the president of CBS News told me to my face, "I want you because you've got it." And I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "I can't tell you what it is, but you got it." The problem with that is it doesn't always work, right? You may think somebody has it, but when you get a chance to know them a little more or see a little more of their work, you realize, you know what? They don't really have it, whatever it is. What they've got is interesting, but it's not enough. Or worse, and I really believe this, is that you pass up people who you don't notice right at the spur of the moment.
Yeah.
And you don't realize until much later that not only have they got it, but they're better than the people you thought, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
People say, "Oh, well, that's the problem with television. It's all phony and it's all based on how you look or how you sound." Well, let me tell you, even from me, I can tell you that's not true. It's not. You've got to have a little more substance than that. But in any profession, the same kind of thing applies. You're attracted sometimes to someone's abilities, on the most scanty of evidence, and it can lead you down the wrong path and can get you and your profession into some trouble. So you got to scratch a little deeper. I mean, initial instincts are pretty good about a lot of things, but I see too many reasons why we should be much more cautious about it than we tend to be.
You write in that in this chapter as well about the two T's, truth and trust, and that's what journalism has, and even there's shades of prescience about today. You also reflect a little bit on Facebook and social media,
Mm-hmm.
and where you think journalism sits now on the sort of that 2T axis, and what do you think is happening with truth and trust? And you've done some interviews. I thought the Globe one was fascinating, and then you pointed me to the one you did with the Star today, and I commend to the audience Peter, not just because I work at the Star, but his interview with the Star today. He has a lot to say about journalism in there that's interesting. We'll talk about that, but tell me a little bit about what you were trying to say in that chapter about truth and trust.
Well, I think we're at a crossroads on those issues, on truth and trust. Because, I mean, let's face it, when you're challenged about how truthful you are or how trustworthy you appear to be, as a journalist, that really strikes at the heart of everything we stand for. We don't have that. I'm not sure exactly what we do have. Because we have to have our credibility to maintain our position as a pillar of democracy. And if we lose that, then a lot of things are in trouble, not just us as a profession. You mentioned, you mentioned the Facebook scenario that we witnessed play out in the last couple of days since the 60 Minutes interview on Sunday night and today in front of the U.S. Congress. But quite frankly, we have known this for years. I watched some of that stuff in the U.S. Congress today, and I thought, where have these people been? Like, come
Yeah.
on, we've been telling you that,
Yeah.
that there's no accountability at Facebook. We've been telling you that for years, and they maintain
You,
they shouldn't have to be accountable. That they're not
you,
a news service. Well, it's just a crock.
you,
They are. They may be
you
just
say
a computer.
they are a news organism. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, that's my argument on truth and trust. That if we lose it, our future is not going to be good. Um, how do we get it? How do we regain that thing? I mean, there you see every year you'll see public opinion surveys that are done, research that's done on the trustworthiness of certain professions, and you always see doctors and nurses or firefighters at the top of that list, and they're pretty well solid there for decades. Journalists are sort of at the halfway mark, somewhere in the 50 to 60 range. They've been a little lower, and they've certainly been higher. But being in the middle of the range is not good enough for us. That's not where we need to be. We can watch politicians plummet to the bottom, and they are, and I'll talk about that in a minute if you want me to. But journalists have to be higher than that. So how do you get higher? How do you develop more trust? I talk in the book about doing one of my lectures at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. There were 100 postgrad students in the room, and I asked them, give me a word, one word or a phrase that describes how you feel the state of journalism is today. And it was awful. It was terrible. Everything from, you're all fake news, or it's all biased, or you tell us stuff we don't want to know, it's boring, it's this, it's that. There were no flattering comments about the state of news. So if we want to improve that, it seemed to me when I looked through all these comments and we probed a little deeper with some of these students, that what had happened here was that they'd lost faith in what we do. In an era where a lot of people lie, they want to be convinced that we're not lying, but we're telling them the truth. And to be seen as the kind of the truth sayer, you've got to prove how you do what you do. You've got to be more transparent about how the decisions are made in the news business. And I think some news organizations are starting to head that way, but I think they can go even further in terms of, like what's news, what isn't news, the classic old question. But, it goes deeper than that. How do you decide to give this story much more play than that story? Where you put it in the newscast, how much space you give it in the newspaper. Why do you give some people anonymity and others not? What's the sourcing issue? How do you play that out? And I think it wouldn't hurt us at all as news organizations to be much more transparent in doing that. Now, I know the media is not a monolith, and we all operate on different levels of policy and guidelines, etc. But I think no matter how we operate, we should spend a little more time realizing that our audience is depending on us, and they're challenging us to be more transparent about the decisions we make. And
you alluded to it in the
yeah.
you alluded to it in one of your articles. I think it was the Star article, and I saw it too, just up the road from where you are right now. I was in Cambridge during the campaign and watched one of those protests, and it was bad. It was awful. But the people they hated second most to Trudeau was the media, and they believed an awful lot of wrong things. That somehow they valued information they were getting off the dark web more than they valued the information. I had one earnest man telling me he felt sorry for me as a member of the media because I did not understand that I'd been hoodwinked into believing. We'll leave aside all the things they were saying, but I had been hoodwinked into believing that Justin Trudeau was a legitimate person. Um, and these people had no respect for police, the media, or anything. And I'm wondering, had you been sitting in the anchor's chair, you've been involved in this campaign, how would you have dealt with that arm of the, maybe they're not watching CBC, but what would you do to get those people to watch CBC or to read the Toronto Star or to bring them back to the world where journalism is a legitimate enterprise? I frankly despaired after I saw these people. I thought we've lost them, and I don't know what you do to get them back.
Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that question either, but there are a growing number of them, right? And that's an issue for all of us, right? You know, in the riding I live in, Perth County, around Stratford, you know, the vote for the People's Party went up to 10% of the vote. Yeah, that doesn't sound like much, but it's a heck of a lot more than it was 2 years ago. And we saw that happen in a number of parts of the country. Let me just say, you know, many of those people, in fact, do watch the CBC and do read the Star because it feeds their anger, right? They get angry. Because of what they see, not because of what they're seeing is biased, but because what they're not seeing is themselves.
Yeah.
And this is part, you know, we saw this in 2016 in the US with Trump, but part of the anger was based on the fact they didn't see themselves in anything in terms of news coverage. And so they were, you know, they were going to take it out on those they felt were responsible for that. What would I have done? Listen, you know, it's easy to sit in the background and you know, fire darts at different organizations. The last thing I want to do is to be saying, "Oh, you know, it's not as good as it used to be." I don't want to be one of those guys. I know what that was like when I was young and listening to being lectured by the old guard. But here's what I will say about the journalists of today. It's like, and I mean today, you know, 2020 and 2021. What journalists did at, you know, at my old organization, at your organization, and, you know, and all the others, was quite remarkable through this period of COVID. That what, you know, young women and men who work in, you know, news organizations across this country, how they have to do their jobs, sometimes without leaving their homes, sometimes by leaving their homes, by leaving their families, their kids, and going into work. You know, the CBC, you know, I had to go in there working on the documentaries that I've been doing. It's like a ghost town in there, but it's not 100% a ghost town. There are people in there every day who have to be there to get a television signal up and get items out and all of that. And what they went through in this campaign was, you know, you and I have done a lot of campaigns over the years. This was unlike any campaign we've ever seen. You know, planes that were, you know, there's a picture on one of the campaign planes that I was on in the early 80s, and it's packed, right? It's a, you know, a big long jet.
60 people, yeah.
Exactly, every seat's filled. On this campaign, most seats were empty, from what I've been told. You know, news organizations weren't sending their people. The parties themselves weren't doing anything like they used to do in terms of airplane, all because of COVID. So what a lot of journalists have had to put up with for the last 2 years and still do their jobs under enormous stress. You know, it's not just the stress that we face as daily reporters, but the added stress of COVID and what it's meant to them personally and their families and their kids and all of that. So I give enormous credit, and it'd be hard for me to sit in the background and pick away at what they could have done better in this campaign, given what they were up against. I mean, I tend to agree with Professor Alboim, my old boss. Well, you will too. That he worries that there's been a little too much opinion creep into daily reporting, like into news reporting. That the separation isn't as clear as it used to be. The impact that social media has had um, on that as well was, reporters,
For sure.
some reporters expressing opinion on things like Twitter that they don't express in their news reporting, but they're tainted by what they've said on social media. So there's concern, in that area. There's the simple concern that there are so many, different organizations with so much pressure put on journalists to perform on so many different platforms. Like most network television reporters, and it's this way now in print as well, are serving so many different masters.
Yeah.
But there's frequently not time to sit there and think through your story. Spend an extra hour making phone calls to talk to sources, because that's kind of next up. You gotta feed the beast, and that beast may be in the case of a television reporter, maybe television, it may be online, it may be radio, it may be any number of different things. And the same happens in print today, which is a very these are very different animals than they were when we started. Well, certainly when I started. I mean, I started with black and white television, right? That's how long ago it was.
Wow.
But, anyway.
I remember on those campaign planes, and I'm getting close to winding it up here, but those campaign planes was the time when journalists get to see each other work. Normally, you work in your own office, but you had to. So I always thought the hardest working person on those campaign planes was the radio reporter, because the radio reporter had to file every hour. Then it would be followed by the TV person, but the TV person had 4 or 5 people. There was a 5-person squad for TV. And then there's the poor beleaguered print person, but we only had one deadline a day. So we could go and I've reflected on it when I only spent 2 days on a campaign plane, but I thought we've all become the radio reporters now. Like we are all filing every hour, right? And we're filing to multiple audiences. The TV people don't have a team of 5 anymore. The print people don't have an all day to do a story. We are all the poor radio reporter now on those campaign planes. And it's, you're right. What suffered is time. Just before we go, I would 2 last things. I just wanted, you alluded to it a bit in the start, and I know listeners of your podcast would get the benefit of your views of it, but what did you think of the last election campaign? It was the first one since 1972 that you haven't been involved in CBC's coverage, right? So what would you have said on the air that night that we would have heard as the results came in?
I'm not sure that I would have had anything more sage to offer than what was already offered. Listen, it was so many things made it a peculiar election. The sense that it started with this kind of dramatic, he's got to win a majority if he's going to survive. That's why he's called it. To why did he call it? To it's really close. And then we went through this period of like 4 to 5 weeks of it's really, really close. It's like tie. And I always used to get carried away in the horse race aspect of these things, but I think I'm not sure what kind of a service we provided by being so focused on the numbers again this time, especially when you actually looked at the numbers, and they're very different. It wasn't just that they were similar, but they were very different than what we were used to for decades, which was a race where whoever was ahead was in the sort of mid to high 30s, and whoever was second was in the mid 30s. And suddenly, Those numbers don't exist anymore. Everything on the part of the leading parties is in the low 30s.
Yeah.
Things have really changed. There's a lot of indecision out there on the part of people as to where they place their support, where they place their vote. And you wonder, are we now into we've had, what is it, 5 out of 7 elections this century have been minorities.
Yeah.
We're clearly in a period of minority government, which may last for some time.
Yeah.
And is that good? Some people think that's great. Some people think that's good for the country. Others go, really, is this the kind of indecision we want to go through? So some of that discussion was being played out on election night. I certainly would have wanted to have taken it there as well. I would have also been very keen on doing the separation between rural and urban Canada in terms of political preference, which is part of the whole issue around polarization, and what it can mean to the country and its future. So, listen, I have, as I've said, people have been trying to bait me into talking about the CBC and the great national conversation about whether the CBC. In my feeling about the CBC, it hasn't really changed over the years. It's a place that gave me this fantastic opportunity and allowed me to do things that I never dreamt of being able to do. But it's still filled with, extremely talented people, in
I agree.
one city next across the country. I have no doubt about that. I have concerns about what I call the strategic direction of the corporation, and that can mean any number of things, from the government that controls its purse, to Parliament, actually, to be more specific, that controls the purse of the CBC, and also controls the executives that are appointed to run it. In some cases, who have no experience whatsoever in broadcasting. I worry about that aspect of what's happened to the corporation, because, like most organizations that are in the business of broadcasting and journalism specifically, it's a very tenuous situation out there, and it needs strong leadership, smart leadership, knowledgeable leadership, and that's what I wish for the CBC, because you watch what's happening to the BBC. The culture secretary in Britain today, in an interview, said, I don't know if there'll even be a BBC in 10 years. Well, if they're saying that in Britain, it won't be long before you're hearing that here, and not just from, some extremes in some parties.
Yeah. Well, I want to end this on a happier note. Well, at least a lighter note. I think I got so much out of this, but I thought we'd wind back in Ottawa, or maybe Gatineau, and tell. You told it on the Sunday edition, but I wonder if you'd tell it for the audience here, just to show what fame brings you. The story of your lead foot and driving to your cottage in the Gatineau Hills.
Sure. Let me just say, before I tell the story, to once again thank you for this opportunity, and to underline, I think, what you said earlier as well. This book isn't about, it's not about whether the CBC. This book is about, my experience and anecdotes associated with a wonderful, 5 decades of being in journalism, and in many cases, the story of my life. But there's a lot of there are a lot of great stories in there, ones that I've enjoyed telling, and it includes this one that you've asked for. I was driving up from Ottawa to the Gatineau, where I've had a place since the early 1980s. In fact, I'll be at it again this weekend for Thanksgiving. But I get a little carried away sometimes when I'm driving in the country, especially in the early mornings. And I was driving up the old Highway number 7. This was before, I think it was just around the time that the 416 was opening. So I was taking the old route up to Ottawa, through Peterborough and up. And it was somewhere between, I think, Perth and Carleton Place that I suddenly realized there was a car behind me with, all kinds of lights blinking on top of it. And it was an OPP officer who pulled me over to the side of the road. And he came up to the window, which I lowered the window. And he said, driver's license, registration, insurance, please. And I said, absolutely. And I got them out and I gave them to him. And he looked at them for a minute and he went, Peter Mansbridge. And I thought, that's great. I was thinking, I really love this job. This is I looked at him and I said, that's right. And he said, you and I were in Scouts together in 1964 or something in Ottawa, St. Matthew's Church. And I had been Sea Scouts. And I looked at him as if I knew who he was, and I went, yeah. And I couldn't remember. And he says, remember that jamboree that we went to, or out on the on the Rideau River, and blah blah blah, and we talked, about some people that we both had friendships with at that time, and I don't know, we talked for 2 or 3 minutes, and then there was the pause in the conversation that comes on those kind of situations, and he looks at me and he says, "So, what do you do now?" Which kind of ruined my whole expectation of what was about to happen, because he then next gave me a ticket. When I told him I was a journalist at the CBC, he wasn't too impressed by that. He was obviously a Lloyd Robertson watcher.
I for anybody, I will say the book is filled with stories about this. Peter does or used to do this event up at the Black Sheep Inn every year, and it was where you realized that Peter Mansbridge is a very, very funny man, and no one was left unscathed in those speeches. And there's lots of that Peter in this book too. There's it is like sitting down. I only wish we had a glass of wine when we were doing this. It was like
Sure.
The book is like sitting down with Peter Mansbridge and getting the fun part of him, the fascinating, the interesting, the thoughtful. So buy it at your local independent bookseller, Beechwood Books, my neighborhood. I highly recommend it, and I feel privileged to have had this conversation with you, Peter. Hope we get to do it in person sometime soon.
Well, thank you, Susan. It's been a real treat, and I appreciate all those who have watched this program and will contemplate at least purchasing the book, because I really enjoyed writing it.
It's fun to read. Good night, everybody. Oh, I should say in Peter Mansbridge form, thanks for watching.